Hello, and welcome to another mini lecture on African American fiction. This week we're going to be looking more at language and dealing with some specifics about how the language that characters use, how the language that writers use, how that helps to express what writers feel, think, and the stories they're trying to tell. Now, by the end of this lecture, you should be able to do three things. These are my goals: know, understand, apply. Know the understand how authors use these languages, and apply how these languages connect to African American literature as performance. That's being our main focus thematically for this 3 weeks, starting last week with film, this week with Top Dog Underdog by Susan Laurie Parks, and next week with A Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hainsberry, to talk a little bit about how African American literature and language becomes innately performative. So we'll take a look at those things, and you should be able to do that. We'll have a review slide at the end just to make sure we're covered. But I want to start by asking you this simple question. What language do you speak? I imagine all of you just said English, because it's a pretty straightforward thing. So you can take a look at that sentence, right? After a grueling day of work, I parked my Hyundai in the garage and martyred TGIF. Makes sense. I imagine most of you can parse that sentence out. Maybe TGIF is a little too old. Maybe that's something from me when my childhood when we were saying thank God it's Friday. But I think most people know that by now. Now, this is English, but what we call English is really a mixture of other things. Start with the structure. This is Latin structure. Latin structure includes this concept of prepositions after a grueling day of work, setting something up to be a longer phrase rather than other languages where it's simply before this, after that, before, during, in, after, before. Single words can come up into play, especially in a lot of Asian languages, including Thai and Hindi. You simply say before, after. You don't have a full phrase to explain everything else, all the organization and details. But in Latin, you have that. In Latin, you also have the subject, I, verb, parked, and then object, my Hyundai, right? So we're basically speaking English, yes, but we're speaking a language that's based on Latin structure. So we're speaking English and Latin. Now we also speak French words. Grueling comes from a French word. Park comes from a French word. Garage comes from a French word. All those things are French in their origin. So even though we speak English, we also are speaking some French and some Latin. And then there's all the German words. English is a highly Germanic language. After, day, work, in, mutter. All of these things are German words. They come from Dutch or German origins. So there's that comes in as well. Because we live in a global marketplace, words like Hyundai or other things, names and brands that come from overseas are part of our language. We know what a Hyundai is, just like we know what a Toyota is or what a RAV4 is. I mean, if we come up with these different things, they're going to come in from a Japanese root or a Korean root or a different Asian root, but they're still understandable. And then, of course, we have Americanized slang. TGIF is not a phrase that's commonly said or commonly known in England or other English-speaking countries. To give you an example, when I was in India, if I were to say TGIF, people would go, I don't understand. That's the name of a restaurant, isn't it? That's the thing. It doesn't make sense necessarily unless you are American and Americanized slang. So really, when you say you speak English, what you're really speaking is a mixture of all these different languages, because English makes its business to be taking a variety of different things. Now, the best thing to do is to think about the fact that we really, when we say we're using English or we say we speak English, we're really talking about 4 distinct languages. And they really are based on the cultural context in which we're giving them. So you're going to have these 4 settings as good guidelines for you to think about what English are you using. Think about it like a classroom, a park, a home, and privately, right? 4 kinds of languages. You have academic language. That's the language that you're going to use in a formal, professionalized setting, especially in classes. These are going to be some more difficult pieces of language. Then there's spoken language. This is most commonly understood, where you can go to a variety of people at a cocktail party or any party, really, just even meeting people, meeting friends, meeting new people. Your spoken language should be easily understood by all manner of people. The home language is going to be a little bit more private. It's going to be a language that's understood by you and the people you live with. Excuse me. It's going to be particular to your home and to your dialect, to your language, to the words and phrases that you and your family have within your own space. And then there's slang and profanity, and that's your own personal language. You get to choose the slang and the words that makes most sense for you. If you think about it almost like text messaging, the slang and the acronyms, the abbreviations that you use and that you've made popular with your friends, that's the kind of English that you're keeping at home just for your private self. Let's take a look at this a little bit more in detail. So we have academic language. Academic language is going to have very formalized, very technical vocabulary. It's also going to have compound and complex sentences. There's going to be lots of clauses, lots of phrases. Things are not going to be easy. So think about it like this sentence. After the climactic klaxon of our Pavlovian terminus resounds, I will commence my habitual embarkation towards my familial hibernaculum. That's a sentence that makes perfect sense. It's grammatically correct. It's well spelled. It does all these things. But the vocabulary is not just there to be pompous. It's there because it's supposed to be formal or technical. I'm using words like Pavlovian. I'm using words like hibernaculum, which give it a more scientific sound. If I'm talking about this, chances are I'm talking about a scientific study of who I am and what I do on a day-to-day basis. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the kind of language that's going to be understood by a lot of other people, which is where spoken language comes into play. And spoken language is also really well known as modern American English. This is the language that people speak when they want to be understood easily. It's easily understood vocabulary. The word lengths aren't too long. If you use anything different, it's going to be still understood. And you're going to mix the length of sentences and words. You can have multiple clauses, but you don't have to. You can be relatively simple. The main point here is to make sure that you can be understood by as many people as possible. So you might say a phrase like, after the last school bell rings, I'll start my daily trip home. That's the same sentence I said on the previous slide. It's just more easily understood than the higher academic language that I tossed out there. Now the home language is going to be different again. Home language and spoken language are often intertwined, especially within white culture, because white culture has come to dominate modern American English conversations so much that it's there. However, home language also includes phrases and jargon familiar only to a few. And the structure can change or jump based on assumed knowledge. So I could tell all of you, once I hear that final poot, I'm going home. And that makes sense to you because you know that within our school, the final bell, the final school bell that I said as a broad generalization in spoken language, and that I called the climactic klaxon of a Pavlovian terminus sounding in my academic language, really sounds like this. Poot. That's the sound in our school. So if I say poot, you know what I mean because that's our home language within our school. I can also have a relatively simple or somewhat grammatically incongruent sentence like I'm going home. In my household, we often drop G's at the ends of words. Going, trying, cooking, making. We say those sorts of things because it's a home language, it's a home dialect. And that's something that makes sense for us, even though it's not grammatically correct to drop the G and misspell sentences in that same way. But it does get across what my home language is like, what my personal language is like. And finally, there's slang and profanity. Now, slang and profanity is going to incorporate colloquial vocabulary. That's local stuff that's familiar to very few people. Simplified structure and grammar. So, I mean, I could say to you and have you understand, shit, when it goes off, I'm on. Right? That makes sense. I can say that and I can have it make sense to you. I use the profanity and to emphasize how much I feel it. I can clap to make the sound effect necessary to stand in for a whole bunch of words. I slap my hands together. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense when I'm not lecturing and visible to you, but trust me, if you have that sort of sound, you're making the sound of a hand going past another hand, and it shows to people that that's a hand gesture that means leave. Go. Now let's simplify structure and grammar. It jumps in for a whole lot of other things. And you don't necessarily have to have a full and complete sentence, but slang and profanity make sense for individuals within their individual context. You can communicate clearly for yourself first, and other people will adjust to you if you are making those sorts of sentences. So those are the four main kinds of language. What's important to think about next is how exactly that language comes to bear in the form of literature. If you think about it like this, we have language that's reflecting the ways that people talk throughout time. From Shakespeare and all of his quotes and phrases to the modern television shows and programs that make increasing use of the fact that texting is a serious way in which we communicate with each other. The language on the left from House of Cards is very simple, it's very direct, it doesn't actually have complete and full sentences, things like okay, be there in 20 minutes, 20 mins, that does not a complete sentence make, but it's there, it's understandable. In the same way that Shakespeare's language, get thee to a nunnery, that which we call a rose would smell as sweet, beware the Ides of March, those things make sense within the context of the play that Shakespeare is writing, and the language itself makes sense in different ways as well. We'll dig a little bit more into Shakespeare in here in a second, but I want to set this up. We use language in literature all the time. The language tells it all. That's what literature is. Literature is a combination of words to try telling a story. The ways in which we're doing that differ from person to person. Language tells everything, and it can start with the way that people speak, and the way that people speak will set up time and place. It will give us the setting, all right? Whenever somebody talks, you get a sense of the setting. People aren't going to be talking about email in the 1500s, right? People aren't going to be talking about I bend my knee to you, my liege, in the modern day. It sets up time and place. It tells us where we are and when we are. It also tells us about characters. It can describe characters, obviously, but it also gives us race, education, age, gender. We know that different people are going to say different things. They're going to say it in different ways. And it shows us a great deal about who is speaking and their fundamental elements. It also gives us emotion. It tells us the tone, the mood, the attitude, the senses of both people who are speaking and the scene in general. Emotion comes across very clearly in language because, of course, there's so many different ways to say the same word. If you think about it, even within slang and profanity, I can say the F word 101 different ways. Don't worry, I'm not going to walk you through all the 101 different ways. But all of those ways can convey something else, from the physical act to the attitude of anger to the disappointment and frustration. All of those things can come across in a very versatile word. So the emotion comes across in different ways and forms based on the language. A character's personality comes across as well, as is the personality of the writer, whether they're optimistic or pessimistic, what their life philosophy is, whether or not they have a sense of humor, what their values, beliefs, or religion might be, the allusions that they make, the strength that they use. All those things come across through personality. Now, perhaps the best example I can give of this is Shakespeare. So I'm going to walk through this a bit, one by one here, dealing with a number of different quotes. Start with setting. From The Tempest, be not afeard. The isle is full of noises, sounds, and sweet airs. Here you have quite clearly a setting established. It begins by describing a place. The isle full of noises, sounds, and sweet airs. In Shakespeare's time, they couldn't afford set dressing, so actors would have to describe it. We hear that we are on an island, that the island has a number of noises, and that there's sounds, there's sweetness in the air. More than that, it also tells us that the people who are on this island, the setting of this time and place, is contemporary to the audience who's hearing it for the first time in Shakespeare's English, or for those of us who are more contemporary, tells us that we are going back into time onto a deserted island. However, it also tells us that the people who are there on the island are trying to be comforting. Be not afeard. Shows that the people who are speaking are more considerate, that this is not a hostile island, but instead is a polite one. Make sense? So we see the setting, and then we can see character. She is spherical, like a globe. It comes from the Comedy of Errors. This is a long description of rather profane commentary about just how big and fat a certain woman is. And that phrase, she is spherical, like a globe, conveys a couple of things very quickly. One, it conveys the fact that this is prose, this is relaxed speak, this is a joke, this is commentary, and it tells us immediately that the character is scared, it tells us immediately that the character is in danger, it tells us also that the character is relatively poor because it's in prose rather than in poetry. But it tells us that while he's poor, he has enough education to understand the concept of a globe rather than to assume maybe that the earth is flat. It knows these sorts of things. He knows what spherical might be. It gives us the sense that he has some education, but is still relatively too poor to be noble, and instead is a servant. And then you can have a great quote from Hamlet, and this is going to get across the emotions. This goodly frame the earth seems to me a sterile promontory. This most excellent canopy the air. This majestic roof fretted with golden fire. Why it appears no more to me than a foul and pestilent congregation of vapors. That sentence does all the things that we just talked about. It sets up the setting. It gives us the sense of obviously being on Earth rather than in space. You aren't going to confuse Hamlet with being some sort of astronaut, obviously. But you also get the idea that he must be out in nature. He's able to touch the earth. He's able to point to the canopy, the air, the majestic roof, the golden fire, the sun. He's able to set you up to know that you are outdoors within this setting. He's also able to tell you that obviously he's more intelligent. This is poetic, so he is of an upper class. He's probably white because this is language and a structure that is far more familiar to upper European languages than to Asia or to Africa. It gives all those things out. It also, most importantly of all, gives across the emotion, the feeling that the character has at the core of this. Sterile, promontory, no more, a good negative phrase, foul, pestilent, congregation of vapors. All these things take different ideas and boil it down to something bad, something unpleasant, something unhappy. The counterpoint with goodly frame, excellent canopy, majestic roof, golden fire, lets us know that he sees some things that are good, but his personal attitude is such that it is still bad. This is a common way of expressing yourself. It's a way of juxtaposing two ideas and showing us what's going on inside the character's mind. And finally, we can see life philosophy, as in the Merchant of Venice. The man that hath not music in himself is fit for treason, stratagems, and spoils. Here we see exactly what a character thinks. They're able to voice their opinion, voice their idea, and in the process show us all where they stand on a certain issue. That a man needs to be musical in some way, otherwise they are no darn good. It's that simple and that direct in terms of expressing an idea, what the character thinks or believes. Now, it makes sense for this all to be true for Shakespeare, but is it really the case that he's the one who's doing it best, or can we take a look and see the same skills in other literature, for instance, in African American literature? And I would say we absolutely can. In the contemporary world, we're reading a lot about urban fiction. These are more popular books that have been written by African American authors in the last 10 or so years. They deal with contemporary African Americans in contemporary situations, often in urban centers, Atlanta and the South primarily, in DC, in New York, in Chicago, in Detroit, and throughout the rest of the country. And it deals with an urban sensibility. This contrasts with more academic language that comes from what we look at as classical African American language. The Souls of Black Folks by W.E.B. Du Bois. And you see the narrative life of Sojourner Truth. You see actually Frederick Douglass. There he is right there, second one down. You can also note things like Solomon Northrop is there as well. These are classical pieces of language, and these are pieces of language that do not necessarily reflect all that African American literature is, but instead reflect what African American literature was within the language of that time, that place, and those writers. Now, it's important if we're going to talk about African American fiction and language within African American fiction to differentiate African American English versus modern American English, because what's happened is we've primarily differentiated the two. Most people believe that African American language does not conform to what many people perceive as modern American English, and this is for a couple of reasons. The home language that's prevalent within African American linguistic communities has expanded to encompass a full culture. And it does this for a couple of reasons. First and foremost is the isolation of African American culture and African American elements. Because we segregated ourselves within America for so long, starting in the time period of slavery where the slaves would live in one portion of the plantation and the white people would live in another, we isolated different groups of people. Slave owners actually were vehemently opposed to their African slaves learning to speak English. That was borne out in our conversation about education. They didn't want people to get education, and so they insisted that they not speak English, that they not learn or study, not find a way to read or write, and that way keeping them poor, keeping them ignorant, and being able to exercise a little bit more power and authority. Isolation plays a great part. Within that time period as well, I should just give this as a detail, those people, people were hurt, beaten, and whipped for trying to speak to their fellow slaves in native African dialects. They were also threatened with having their tongue cut out if they started to speak and agitate other people within English. So what ended up happening is within their isolated community, African Americans who were held in slavery created their own form of language. They created their own variations in terms of mixing West African structure rather than Latin structure with English words and phrases, which is how we came up with a sort of different language. It's whole, it's complete, it has its own set of rules and grammar, but because it's not adopted by the mainstream, because it's only held in isolated minority pockets, it's seen as not equal to modern American English. Now, the isolation, it played a big part, but it also continues to play a part because people within the African American linguistic community continue to remain in close proximity to each other. We've maintained segregation for a great length of time. We have different neighborhoods. You know that there's a black neighborhood and a white neighborhood. You don't see a lot of integration within towns and cities. You don't see a lot of integration within social groups. You don't see a lot of integration within schools even. And the more that there's proximity within groups of people, the more that language becomes deeper and more firmly embedded within a culture. So ultimately, African American language becomes its own subset of English. And there are doctors, there are lawyers, there are university professors who are just as uncomfortable or unfamiliar with African American English as the vast majority of white people are. I would imagine that Barack Obama and various college professors, Cornell West and at Harvard, those are people who don't know how to speak African American English any more than I do. And at the same time, there are white people who do live in greater proximity or within the isolated African American communities who may feel more comfortable speaking African American English than modern American English. So this is not universal. I'm not implying that just because somebody is African American, they speak African American English. That's not the case. But I will tell you that this language serves as a dominant cultural expression and occasionally can be misapplied as a stereotyped language. This is where you would hear people talking about, as in the case of the Florida man who shot an unarmed teenager for playing his music too loudly, who said that he was playing that rap crap, who talked about the fact that, I mean, the boy was speaking to him in language that he didn't understand. It's stereotyped, and even though the boy's friends claim that that was not the case, that they don't speak that way, it's assumed based solely on race and culture. Now, if we assume that there is an given that there is an African American language, think about what this is going to mean for readers. Okay? Now, here's the deal. African American language, it will pervade African American literature. Because while it is not a universal truth that all African Americans speak that language, it's fair to say that many African American writers can use African American language to show, as I suggested, setting, character, emotion, and personality. Starting with the setting, it can establish very quickly that this is not Renaissance Europe. The language that's used within a piece of urban fiction is going to establish very clearly that you are not watching Hamlet. You're not reading Hamlet. You are instead getting a stronger sense of where African Americans are going to be, namely in African American communities. The characters are not going to be upper class English people. You're not going to see the academic language that's common in, say, Downton Abbey or Pride and Prejudice or Jane Austen books. That's not going to be the language that's used. It's not going to be, zounds, good sir, I do say to thee, I hath a great need for some pumpkin pie. You won't hear that in African American English. You're going to hear something more simple. Not more simple. You're going to hear something that's more direct and more genuine. Characters are going to express themselves in a way that's actually relevant to them. It would be inaccurate to force a certain kind of language into African American literature. That's not African American language. It's worth noting that the emotions that are going to be there are going to be the same as others, but can be expressed differently. One great example of this is the idea of double negatives. In modern American English and in academic English and in older English from Shakespeare, to give a double negative, to say not twice is grammatically incorrect. I could not say I ain't got no money today, right? That you wouldn't hear that. You could hear somebody say, I hate the fact that I have no money ever. It makes me sick inside. That's fair to say, and it shows an emotion, it shows frustration, it shows poverty, it shows all those issues. But within an African American language, it's I ain't got no time to be messing with no woman. That phrase emphasizes I ain't got no time to be messing with no woman. 3 negatives, not 2, but 3, emphasizes just how little time you have to do with it. It emphasizes the same emotion, the intensity, the extremity to which one doesn't have time to deal with other people, rather than just saying, I can't spend any time with you, darling, it's not possible. I mean, that's simplified. It's common spoken English, and you can say it in such a way that it's intense. But if you can use the double negatives, the triple negatives, quadruple negatives, if you can use a bunch of negatives, you can express the same thing in a slightly different way, in a more culturally responsive, culturally respectful way. And finally, you're going to see personality. And personality is unique to every person. So African American language is going to show someone who speaks the African American language. Doesn't necessarily guarantee they're going to be white or black, but it does guarantee that you're going to see their personality in a different way. However they express themselves is going to be unique and personal to the character. What this basically means, as I've said, is that home language, where we've started the home language and expanded it out to be the home language for an entire community or culture, emphasizes these things. It's worth thinking about it like this. In African American literature, words are not going to lie on the page, and your eyes are not going to just consume the text. Characters are not going to operate inside a vacuum. These are beliefs, these are assumptions, these are things that we believe based on modern American English or academic English, that this should be what happened. The word should be on the page, your eyes should be able to understand it, and the characters should be understandable to everyone. But remember, that's spoken English. That might be academic English, but it's not home language English, right? Instead, you're going to need to change your sensibility. Home language is more personal, more private, and more familiar to a small group. So the words aren't going to lie on the page. Instead, what they'll do is they're going to move. They're going to perform a cultural function. They're not just going to sit there to be read. They're going to act as a signifier for themselves of where you are and what's going on. Your eyes aren't going to just look at and see, this is the phrase that's being said. Your ears are going to need to hear the text and all that the text offers us. The phrases should be clearly heard when they're written in the home language, so that phrases that you see on the page sound like what you might hear people say in dialogue. It's not going to be translated or transcribed. It's going to sound legitimately like what you would hear walking down Hennepin Avenue. And finally, it should make it clear that the stage and reality of the situation is real. This isn't a vacuum. This isn't going to happen anywhere. It's happening in one specific place. The setting becomes very important. The area, the environment that the characters are living in and working in is real. And we should be able to understand just how real and just how immediate that situation is. Those are going to be some of the big differences between the mainstream English that you're going to see there on the left and the home language that you're going to see there on the right. So just to recap, there are 4 kinds of language. Remember that. We're going to know them. Academic, home, spoken, profanity, slang. Okay? Authors are going to use language in a variety of different ways, usually to establish, again, 4 things: setting, characters, emotions, and personality. Each one of those 4 kinds of language can set up each one of those 4 things the authors want to convey. Academic language might convey, obviously, a academic, college, collegiate, pompous setting, pompous characters. They can convey more dry, distance emotion, and convey the personality of somebody who values intelligence a great deal. whereas the home language that we might see more frequently within African American English and African American literature is going to convey a setting, character, emotion, and personality that's going to be a great distance from the academic language. Now, the final thing to think about again is how this links to African American fiction as performers. And the key thing to think about is whatever text you're reading, whether it's a play, whether it's a poem, whether it's a novel, is going to not just sit there as a description of the world, it's going to stand out as a way to bring you, the reader, into the world, to invite you to read, to hear, and to see, like you would have at a performance, hearing and seeing a culture working at once. Thank you very much for watching this. I hope you enjoy the week and the play that's been selected.